Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive geopolitical shift. We're talking about Brazil's absolute resurgence as a global environmental power. I mean, from the deep ocean trenches all the way to the dense canopy of the Amazon, Brazil is stepping back onto the world stage in a huge way. They're combining these incredibly ambitious domestic environmental policies with some seriously assertive international diplomacy. Honestly, if you want to understand where global climate policy is heading right now, you absolutely have to look at what Brazil is doing. So, let's get into it.
To get a real handle on Brazil's current position, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the global evolution of sustainability. Then, we'll cover Brazilian climate diplomacy, biodiversity, and the Amazon Fund, the expansion of the Blue Amazon, and wrap it up with climate justice and financing.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the evolution of sustainability. You know, environmental concerns weren't always the global priority they are today.
If we trace the history, we can see a fascinating shift in global consciousness. Back in the early 70s, at the Stockholm Conference, there was actually a lot of tension. A lot of developing nations felt like environmental protection was just an agenda pushed by rich countries to kind of, slow down their own economic growth. They argued that poverty was the real greatest polluter. But Stockholm did plant a seed called eco-development. Fast forward to 1992, and boom, a radical shift. The Rio Earth Summit, hosted right in Brazil by the way, completely changed the game with Agenda 21. It proved that environmental protection and economic progress absolutely had to go hand in hand. And this whole journey really culminated in 2015 when the UN unanimously adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, pretty much cementing sustainability as a shared, interconnected necessity for every single nation.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core concept from the famous 1987 Brundtland Report. It's actually pretty simple. Economy, society, and environment have to overlap. The report defines sustainable development as meeting our present needs without, stealing from future generations. The main takeaway here? You literally cannot separate human prosperity and social inclusion from the protection of our natural world. They are fundamentally intertwined.
Moving on to Section 2, Brazilian climate diplomacy. Let's zoom in on Brazil's specific role here.
Brazil is in this incredibly unique spot as a developing nation with just massive environmental leverage, and this 50% figure really proves it. This is Brazil's updated nationally determined contribution, or NDC. Basically, it's their official pledge to the planet. They've committed to slashing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, compared to 2005 levels, and they're aiming for full carbon neutrality by 2050. That is a massively ambitious domestic goal, and it's a clear signal that Brazil is taking its environmental policies extremely seriously.
And you see, this domestic ambition translates right into a really assertive diplomatic strategy. Just look at how they showed up at COP28 in Dubai. They weren't just sitting quietly in the back, they were actively driving the conversation. The Brazilian delegation explicitly demanded a gradual elimination of fossil fuels. But they aren't just making demands, they're bringing cooperative solutions to the table. They secured a €100 million partnership with Germany to restore the Cerrado and the Amazon, and they even launched a roadmap to mission 1.5 degrees Celsius with Azerbaijan and the UAE. They are really stepping up as a mediator between the global south and the global north.
But, hey, we all know diplomatic talk is pretty cheap without hard data to back it up, right? Well, in the first 11 months of 2023, deforestation in the Amazon dropped by roughly 50%. That is huge. And this kind of domestic data is exactly what gives Brazil its international credibility. When they step up to the mic at a global summit and demand action, they can point right at this 50% drop and say, look, we are doing the hard work at home.
Which brings us right to Section 3, Biodiversity and the Amazon Fund.
So the crucial point is this. As a megadiverse country that's home to roughly 20% of all known species on Earth, Brazil isn't just protecting some trees. They are managing a giant chunk of the entire planet's natural wealth. And right at the core of Brazil's modern environmental policy is this concept called Floresta em Pé, which translates to the standing forest. It tackles a really harsh reality. You can't preserve nature by keeping people in poverty. You can't just tell millions of people living in the Amazon to stop trying to develop. Instead, the standing forest principle argues that conservation has to be tied to the economic development of local communities through smart, innovative economic mechanisms. Simply put, the forest has to be worth more standing up than it is cut down.
The absolute best example of this standing forest concept in the real world is the Amazon Fund. It was set up back in 2008 to use international capital to fund local conservation and sustainable development. These are often called REDD+ projects, which basically reward developing nations for curbing deforestation.
Historically, countries like Norway and Germany have footed the bill as the primary donors, but recently, thanks to Brazil's renewed diplomatic push in 2023, we've seen major new financial pledges roll in from the United States and France. It's just a fantastic mechanism that lets the global community financially back the sovereign protection of the rainforest.
All right, let's pivot from the green rainforest to the ocean in Section 4, the expansion of the Blue Amazon.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that Brazil's environmental policies aren't just terrestrial. 900,000 kilometers. That is a staggering amount of geological data Brazil has collected through its LPLAC program. It's a scientific initiative designed to meticulously map out their extended continental shelf. And this isn't just about making better maps. This is about establishing sovereign rights over a massive maritime territory. It's an ocean area so resource-rich and ecologically critical that they literally call it the Blue Amazon.
Of course, managing a maritime expansion of this size requires a really delicate balancing act. The Blue Amazon policy has a dual purpose. On one hand, it legally opens the door for the economic exploration of huge offshore resources. We're talking deep-sea oil, gas, and minerals. But crucially, on the other hand, it mandates intense scientific research and rigorous environmental monitoring. Brazil is essentially saying that with sovereign economic rights comes an absolute responsibility to guard these fragile deep-sea ecosystems from reckless exploitation.
And that brings us to our final pillar, Section 5, Climate Justice and Financing.
Because at the end of the day, all of these policies, whether it's stopping deforestation or mapping the ocean floor, they require immense amounts of capital and a really strong focus on human rights. Brazil's diplomatic platform is deeply anchored in climate justice. This is the understanding that the most vulnerable populations, poorer communities, traditional populations, they're the ones who suffer the absolute worst impacts of environmental degradation, even though they contributed the least to the problem. Brazil's stance is that having a healthy planet doesn't mean much if billions of people are stuck in poverty without a voice. So true sustainability requires policies that tackle environmental protection and deeply rooted social inequality at the exact same time. You literally can't have one without the other.
Let's see how this builds into the actual money side of things, because making this a reality requires a massive overhaul of global finance. Funding sustainable development takes both public and private money, and Brazil is actively trying to utilize and reform both. On the public side, you have multilateral institutions like the BRICS New Development Bank, which is committing 30% of its future financing directly to climate action. Contrast that with private mechanisms like Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which allows countries to trade carbon credits. Brazil is setting itself up to be a massive supplier of forest conservation credits in a global carbon market. Both of these funding streams are absolutely essential to making that standing forest idea economically viable. To really sum up the country's current policy trajectory, we can look at this statement from President Lula. Brazil is back in the world with the determination to help build a sustainable, peaceful, and just future for all of humanity. It perfectly encapsulates their renewed multilateral engagement. It's a diplomatic strategy that combines demanding historical accountability from developed nations with a real willingness to lead by example at home.
So I want to leave you with this question to chew on. How will Brazil's dual role as an economic developer and an environmental guardian shape the future of our planet? They are attempting this massive, incredibly complex balancing act that honestly the whole world is relying on. Will their innovative economic mechanisms and bold diplomacy be enough to keep the forest standing and the oceans clean? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Definitely keep your eyes on Brazil's environmental diplomacy. It is for sure a story that will define our century. See you next time.